Hello, I'm Jim Frederick. In this segment, we're talking about the Chinese economic transition from socialism to more of a market-oriented economy. So we're going to start with Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a Marxist-Leninist. He took his model of socialism from Joseph Stalin. So when Mao Zedong drove the Chinese nationalist government out of the mainland and onto Taiwan in 1949, Mao decided to institute a socialism patterned after the model of the Soviet Russia. So in Mao's version of the economy, the land was taken away from the large landowners of China and given to peasants, and Mao formed small collective farms. Mao also nationalized industry over a period of a few years, and he instituted 5-year plans like the Soviets had been using. Now, in these 5-year plans, there was a government agency that would determine what different factories are going to produce. If you don't have the market trying to decide what's going to be produced, there has to be a government agency that's going to decide what factories are going to produce. This agency would also tell each factory where its output was supposed to go. Now, in 1958, Mao started a program he called his Great Leap Forward. In the Great Leap Forward, the small collective farms were merged into large farm communes. And when I say large, we're thinking about 1,000 families or so being merged into a single organization, single communes. He also encouraged small-scale industry in the rural areas. Many of these communes were told to create steel foundries. These are basically backyard, very small steel foundries. The agricultural communes were expected to contribute a large fraction of their crop to the government, so that the government could distribute the crop in the cities and to factory workers. But for one reason or another, the plan was a big disaster, and tens of millions of people starved. The estimates are hard to come by. But some people estimate 30,000. Some people estimate 30 million Chinese died, and others say 60 million Chinese died of starvation. Now, Mao died in 1976, and Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978. Deng was a pragmatic politician, a cautious politician. He described his philosophy of leadership as fording a river by feeling for the stones. In other words, he was going to make progress in small steps, very cautious steps. Now, if you're a politician in China that's trying to consolidate power, you could go on a tour and visit the important national sites like Mao's birthplace. But in 1992, Deng took a tour of the southern provinces in China. Now, the southern provinces had been experimenting with market-oriented economic systems, market reforms. These reforms turned out to be quite prosperous and quite successful. So with his 1992 tour, Deng was highlighting the success of these market experiments. I don't think that he particularly was in favor of free market systems philosophically, but I think he was being pragmatic. He saw that these systems were being successful, were being productive, and he wanted more of the Chinese economy to be that way. So Deng instituted what's come to be called market socialism. Under his market socialism, the market side is that there was no Soviet-style economic planning, no government agency that's telling each business what to produce. Also, the prices of products, and I emphasize products here, was driven by market forces of demand and supply. No government agency telling people what the price of output goods was going to be. There was a mixture of private enterprise and state-controlled enterprise. The businesses, private businesses, were encouraged to be successful, to make a profit, which many hardline communists just found very distasteful. And even the government-controlled, state-controlled enterprises were encouraged to act like profit-seeking businesses. Of course, they weren't allowed to keep their profits, but they were encouraged to produce goods that the public wanted to buy and to judge their success or output based on things like profits. Now, the state side, the government side of market socialism was that there was no ownership of land. The government owned the land, so this is still truly socialism. Socialism means government ownership of the means of production, like the land and the factories. So there was no private property. Land could be leased, on the other hand, for long-term contracts, and people did have the right to transfer the remaining portion of their lease to somebody else. The 5-year plans persisted, but they were now called guidelines. So they were more like the budget guidelines that the US president proposes. They're proposed suggested directions for the economy, but there's no, the government planning has been taken out of that. That is, the government direction has been taken out of these 5-year plans. Input prices are still manipulated in China. The energy prices, petroleum for example here, are heavily subsidized. It's estimated that the cost of petroleum to a business in China is about half of what it would be on a free market based on world prices. Interest rates are also determined by the government. And there are minimum wage rates that affect the businesses and how much businesses will want to hire. Recent estimates say that about 3% of the Chinese businesses are state-controlled, government-controlled enterprises, firms. That is, if you had a list of Chinese companies, about 3% of them would be government-controlled. That amounts to about 150,000 firms owned by the government, although that list has been whittled down in the recent years. And about 40% of the industrial sector is state-controlled. So most of the state-controlled businesses are heavier industries, and they amount to about half of China's gross domestic product, half of their output. Now, in terms of the government control, many people are surprised to find out that the central government in China is rather weak. Most of the government power in China is with the provincial governments. However, the Communist Party in China controls the bureaucracy by making appointments to the central government, to the provincial governments, and to the local governments. They also make appointments to the government-controlled enterprises. So the party can direct the government banks to make loans to certain individuals or certain businesses, or not make loans to certain businesses as they see fit. And as it turns out, then the government banks generally do not make loans to private enterprise. Private enterprise has to go out and find other sources of funding, which makes it difficult for the private sector. The party can also tell officials to ignore rules, ignore the law. Now, this willingness to ignore the law, of course, allows corruption. There is a problem of corruption, reportedly, in China. But it also has some benefits. It allows some flexibility. The experiments with the market reforms started off with people disobeying the law. The small Chinese farmer who decided to sell crop on his own was breaking the law. And if the law had been rigidly enforced, people would not have seen how productive the private sector was going to be in China. And these market reforms might never have occurred. Now, the party does discourage bribes to party officials and to government appointees. However, there's nothing in the law that says their children cannot be given excellent jobs, high or good salaries. Nothing says the children can't be bribed. And so we've got some people who are derogatorily called princelings. But they're a group of people who are the sons, generally, of high-ranking party officials and high-ranking government appointees. It's interesting to look at how the gross domestic product in China is different from the gross domestic product in the United States. The bars on the right show consumption, and we see that the United States spends about almost 70% of its GDP on consumption, which means that about almost 70% of our production in the economy of final goods is for consumer goods. That fraction in China is almost half of what it is in the United States. They spend about 36-37% of their GDP making consumer goods. On the other hand, look at the middle bars in this graph. The middle bars represent plant and equipment, so that represents factories. It represents machinery, trucks, and China's devoting a little bit more than 45% of its, maybe 46-47% of its GDP to producing equipment and factories and such. Now the last two on the right, the bars on the right show net exports, and it's interesting to see that the U.S. economy, of course, has a trade deficit. Our imports are greater than our exports, but the Chinese economy has a slight trade surplus there. So as you'd expect, Chinese growth, the annual growth rate in China is much higher than in the United States, because China is devoting more of its GDP to producing capital goods, machinery and factories and such. So their GDP was growing at 7.6% in 2013, whereas in the United States, the GDP was growing at 1.6%. The per capita GDP in China was $9,800 US dollars at purchasing power parity rates, exchange rates, whereas in the United States, the per capita GDP is $52,800, almost $53,000 per capita income in the United States. Significant difference there. Now, let's look at the bottom line here. It's interesting that China has a Gini index of 47% from 2012, whereas the United States has a Gini index of 45. So the US Gini index is slightly lower. The Gini index is a measure of inequality of income among households. So this indicates that the Chinese economy has a slightly higher level of income inequality than the United States has. And that's partly due to the fact that the Chinese economy is a third world economy, or well, developing from a third world economy. It's a transitional economy, and you do expect third world countries to have high Gini indexes, very high levels of inequality, but it's probably also a reflection of the power of these princelings, the amount of income that's going to people like these princelings. Thank you.